Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jeff Schollenberger. This is another installment of Compact Conversations. This week, I'll be speaking to Jacob Savage, who recently contributed a very viral piece for us on the vanishing white male writer. So thanks for joining me, Jacob, and for contributing this piece.
Sure, happy to, and thanks for publishing it.
So this piece, I'd say, qualifies as quite viral, which is a particularly impressive achievement in these days when things don't really or links to articles don't go viral on Twitter anymore by design. The social media space is much more fragmented, etc. So it's a harder thing to achieve than it was in the 2010s. But this piece did circulate and make the rounds and get discussed quite a lot. So congrats on that. I'm just curious, what you make of that. What was it that hit a nerve about that, about this piece in this particular moment, and sort of worked against, I guess, the kind of antiviral structures that seem to dominate the internet now?
I think people everyone wants confirmation of how they feel about things, and anything that sort of marshals some statistical claim to something, I think, has a lot more power than, we're sort of in the golden age of vibes pieces, and just sort of like, this is happening, I feel it. But I guess, what I think there was an appetite, I think, to just be shown the thing that you are, internally feeling. And I think that's why it went viral, although, I don't know how any of this stuff actually works.
Yeah, so it's worth noting you do begin the piece, and obviously people should check it out on the Compact site if they haven't already, but you begin it by kind of laying out some numbers. And I'm sort of curious at what point did you start sort of trying to run the numbers on this set of phenomena, and what motivated that on your end?
So this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and mainly not actually in the field of literature. I had a sort of much longer article I've been plotting and not writing about white male millennials. And sort of randomly, I was like having a conversation with an editor friend of mine, and she was like, there's no white male millennial. I think we were talking about Long Island Compromise, and it just occurred that I think sort of both of us, that there were no white male millennial novelists that you could sort of think of or had written anything. I mean, there were that you could think of, but that had written anything zeitgeisty. And so I sort of like got into it and then got really sort of deeper and deeper into the weeds. And I was sort of surprised at how, as someone who sort of already knew this, I was also surprised at how sort of complete the lack of any output that seems to have made any cultural mark of our generation.
So, I suppose one genre of response to the piece was one that you sort of anticipate in it, which is, why should we care? And, you speak to people who themselves could arguably be construed as sort of the victims of this marginalization, or the casualties of it, at least. And, some of them sort of say to you, well, why should I feel sorry for myself? Why should we care? This is some sort of, reshuffling that, reverses years in which the underrepresentation went in the other direction. So, what's the big deal? And you anticipate and discuss that response in the piece. Of course, inevitably, people nevertheless, shared it just kind of with the headline, but didn't really, necessarily read any further. So, how do you sort of answer that that response?
Um, I mean, I think that the reason we should care isn't. I mean, if you're one of the affected people, I don't. I think it's sort of inhuman to say like you shouldn't care. But okay, on a broader social, cultural level, is the world that much worse because there aren't any white male millennial novelists of note? Probably not. But you want an art that sort of deals honestly with the world around it. And I really do maintain that this is bad for everyone. I think um, I just want, people to be honest in art. I don't want a white male identitarian fiction niche. I want people to be able to write what they want and write creatively and, do things that are interesting. And I feel like this is more a symptom of a culture that, a stuck culture that doesn't do things that are interesting than anything else. Um,
Yeah, and here it's perhaps worth getting into the later part of the piece. You do sort of analyze a few writers who do fall into this niche and have achieved at least some degree of visibility in recent years, and so part of what you're offering is a critique of those writers who do kind of fall into this category who are active today. And so, it seemed to me part of the piece also just came out of your reading those authors.
Yeah, I think what happened partly is I read Tony Tula Tamute's novel, which I loved, and I was like, and it sort of occurred to me that this novel could not have been written by a white man. Like it just could not have. It could not have been published. It would not have received the. If it had been published, say by a tiny press, I don't think anyone would have deigned to give it attention. And I thought that it was a great novel, and I was like, why? You sort of think, okay, like it's weird. He can write, sort of a female white character. He can write like a Thai character. He can write a white male character. And I think that like a white man of his, and he's incredibly talented. I think there are very few white men writers who would be as talented as he is. But, there are probably a few out there. I don't think they could get away with it. And I think in a world in which, you are these sort of creative possibilities are foreclosed, it's everyone is sort of worse off for it in the end.
What's your overall sense of the writers you do discuss in the piece? What, and I suppose in terms of that criterion of honesty, or showing us the world around us, like in what way do they fall short as you see it?
I mean, I think there are different ways of falling short, and I think that it's possible to not fall short and just completely ignore the world around you and write a fantastic novel. Um, but I think that just sort of in the choice of stuff that people do, like I think the other thing that I read that I think crystallized my thinking on this was alongside Tony Tamute's book. I read a couple of the chapters from Ben Shattuck's book, which is honestly probably the worst book I've ever read. And it there's this like it reeks of wanting to be liked in this way that is so, I think, poisonous to art. And it's just you can sort of picture the creative writing center at Iowa in which like you know someone's like, yeah, I'm gonna write like a story, like an Alan Lomax but gay story, um, in which nothing happens, in which like everyone is nice to each other, and the idea that like, and for me that, I mean, like I think a lot of the other examples are like some of those books are very good, but much narrower in scope. Um, but to me that book, I was just like, this is the purest symptom of this malaise that we have. Like it just there could be no worse book if you like want to teach, if the academy still exists in 100 years and you wanted to sort of explain the 2010s. I almost would recommend that book as like a way of getting into the a sort of poisonous cultural rot. Anyway, sorry, Ben.
I was curious what you made of the film American Fiction, which was quite successful and seemed to at least it was one sort of indicator of the ongoing vibe shift, I suppose, because interestingly, it actually is based on this novel Erasure that came out roughly 20 years prior, I believe. I can't remember exactly when it was first released, like late 90s, early 2000s, but the Percival
Like
Everett novel.
2001,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
So it's actually more responding to this like 90s moment of political correctness, I suppose, in its original formulation. But then when it's released as a film in 2023, I believe it sort of is it's an opportunity to start making fun of the sort of broad Great Awakening in terms of how it affected literature and the publishing industry and so on. And it seems to be, or it seems to signal a shift away from the pieties of the at least peak sort of 2010s moment. And I suppose one thing that's kind of interesting about it in terms of your analysis is it is kind of about this question of honesty, where the on one hand what they want from the writer, at the center of it is this kind of ludicrous performance of supposed honesty about his about a sort of stereotyped version of his racial plight. And then but what that expectation forces him into is this deception and fraud, which is sort of the source of the humor. But in any case, I was just wondering what you made of that film, both the film itself, but also like what it signaled about the direction of the culture.
I mean, I think on the one, I think that film. I mean, I actually thought I thought I was gonna dislike the critique part of the film. I actually enjoyed that, and I thought that the sort of personal stuff, which seemed like left over from the novel, was the weak point. But I think there are a couple things that are interesting about that film to me, which is one, like obviously what I'm talking about, and I wrote about white male millennials because that's who I am, and I think again. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, who was like, but you don't understand, this is true for, like I'm a Black woman. This is like, we've been like forced to write this like stupid crap too. Like, and I'm like, well, at least you get published, but like, but I think I think it was like a necessary in that sense, like to sort of, say like there are stories and we don't need these tales of woe that are completely manufactured. I do think what's also interesting about it is the movie itself is the thing that it's critiquing, in that there's like a rapturous audience of like largely like white people who want to be scolded like this, like even within a film about the scolding of the people. But yeah, I think this is, to get to the larger question of art, I think like this has been a problem for everyone, not just white men. White men happen to not publish as much because of it, but I think it's made a lot of other books much worse than they might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of it is also I suppose maybe part of what's part of the reaction to the piece is that people are sort of primed to think about things in terms of narratives of victimhood and who the victims are of a given situation. And so on one hand, I think part of what makes your framing provocative is that it is willing to at least initially present it that way. But I think ultimately that's not, as I understood it, really your point. And so those who kind of read it that way kind of missed what you were really getting at. But nonetheless, I mean, I think this, maybe the broader thing is this this demand for narratives of victimhood, which has kind of produced a lot of the pathologies that that film is making fun of. But and that on the right you do have like I'm trying to think. There's a book by like a conservative commentator named, I think, Jeremy Carl, that's called like Unprotected Class or something, and it's like about how white men are the actual victims of American society or something like this. So you see that kind of inversion narrative that takes place on the right.
I
Um,
Yeah, I
and
think there's the thing that will solve this is like a sort of white identitarian fiction, and it's like no, the thing that will solve it, like the point of fiction, and there's that like great Zadie Smith essay, but is to sort of inhabit other worlds like other than your own. And I think part of what's happened over the last decade is that possibility has been specifically foreclosed to like younger white men, and has made their novels worse for it. But you're not going to. The other thing I saw like a little critique, from the right, which is like, who cares about the New Yorker? Who cares about, just, no one cares about reading, just publish, write what you're going to write on your, write it on Substack, self-publish it on Amazon. And it's like, do you really want to give up on like the idea of any shared culture that anyone has? Do you really want, what, no writer in the last 200 years has dreamed of having a readership of 500 people who don't, who are all rate, like it's just, you want a culture that, like moves together in some way. And I think, to silo everyone, is a mistake. And I don't think the cure for this is some sort of like, well, now we're just going to publish like tales of like white men being sad, or angry. You want a bigger thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I was wondering whether, in terms of what you were getting at towards the end of the piece, it seemed, and this is perhaps why I was reminded of American Fiction as well, because it was, about, or it presents a version of art that is partly about the predicament of art at the current moment. And so it seems like, part of what you're getting at towards the end is that the situation of the writer, of the profile you're focused on, is itself a sort of interesting, or provides potentially interesting subject matter, as I
Yeah,
understand.
no, I think it does. Like, I think there's something where it's almost like you would expect, given what has happened in the last decade, like a certain kind of like millennial writer to be more immune from these. That like I'm not going to try to like fit into this identity box because there's no way I can, and the thing that I will produce will be poor for it. And just the sort of intrinsic understanding of that should lead to some creative flowering. And maybe it's coming. There are a lot of books that are coming out this year or next year that seem to be by white male millennials. Hopefully they're good. But I don't, but it feels like that, there should be some sort of immunity. Like you don't have to be like Ben Lerner at the end of the Topeka School, like talking about how like he's unlearned his like white maleness. You understand that that's ridiculous, so just write the book. uh and having faced what like white male millennials, or upper, the literary world white male millennials have faced in the last decade, they should be able to sort of say like, Ben Lerners of the world, like screw off, like we have something more authentic and real to offer. But they haven't, so that's sort of the crux, I guess.
I'm glad you brought up Topeka School. That I found that book very annoying. Uh, and I had really liked Leaving the Atocha Station. I'm not sure what you thought of that, but and it had this kind of capacity for self, this kind of self-reflective capacity that um, I thought was completely lost in the Topeka School, and which became incredibly sort of pious and self-serious in ways I really that very much turned me off, and seemed like one of the worst instances of how the first Trump term sort of made literature worse.
Yeah, I almost I mean maybe you disagree. I sort of liked the Topeka School up until the end, which I thought basically ruined the entire book. Um, it's suddenly it's 2016 and like there are good guys and bad guys, and the bad guy from 1996 is wearing a red baseball hat, and I'm at an ICE protest. So it's just so risible in its conclusions. Um, that it sort of poisoned the rest of the book for me, which I think I liked as I was reading it. I don't quite, remember, but the end of it just completely destroyed any like residual goodwill I had for it.
Agreed. Yeah, I felt similarly, and I do also remember enjoying and certainly like giving it the benefit of the doubt for most of it, and then finding the ending just incredibly irritating. And I don't know, the thing that this is like a random thing in leaving the Atocha station that I for some reason I recall frequently is this moment where he's like trying to flirt with this, or he's trying to get in bed with or something, this Spanish girl, and he says at some point he says like his father was a fascist or something like that. And so and there's kind of this idea that he's like trying to play into this, I don't know, sort of Spanish like lefty, students' ideas about like middle American fathers being these kind of authoritarian monsters, and also this kind of ambient anti-fascism. And the point is to kind of he's clearly kind of self-parodying in that moment. His own kind of political, cynicism, which he's using to kind of ingratiate himself to this girl. So I don't know. When I got to the end of the Topeka School, I was like, now he's sort of conjured up this like fantasy of middle American fascism that is just similarly like self-serving in the way that he sort of is parodying. So I don't know. That was like my
Yeah, no,
that was the thing that stood with me.
I think he suffers from that same thing that a lot of the millennial writers suffer from, which is like there's the need, and I think this is part of what the collapse of the distinction between like author and character is, the need for the author to be like a good person, um, or the book to reflect well on the author as a human, and not, here are some characters and some of them are terrible and I can get into the mind of a terrible person and portray them sympathetically. Um, and I think, yeah, so I think that's like happened clearly for like a whole lot of authors, where there's just no ability to separate yourself from your work. And um, no one wants to just read books about like people who mean well. Like, I don't know. like, um, and
Yeah, no, I mean, I was curious how you see the rise of autofiction, kind of playing into this story, which is, it's sort of odd in relation to, the sort of, there's like the intensive focus on representation and the idea that the author has to, represent some demographic, and also the, as you said, the collapse of author and character, like that, if a character says something, that's often taken to, or with these book kind of cancellations and freakouts, was often taken to sort of somehow embody the views of the author. So I don't know, how does like autofiction as a genre fit into, as and the way that it became kind of the dominant genre of the past sort of 10 or 15 years, like fit into this story.
well, yeah, well, I think that the autofiction stuff is sort of a like an inevitable result of the appropriation discourse of the 2010s. So like if you can't appropriate someone else's story, like the only story left is your own, or some lightly fictionalized version of your own. And I actually, there was like I think there was this was a good, there was a paragraph that I deleted from the piece, but it was about Dean Kissick's article in Harper's, and there was a quote that he had that I think really sort of summed it up, which is, quote, "If an artwork's effective power derives from the artist's biography rather than the work, then self-expression is redundant." And I think that that means like in the art world, and also I think in literature, I think they're closely related in terms of the cultural shifts. White men's like biographies are irrelevant in terms of so, but has become the primary relevant thing to marketing a piece of art. So you're left, you end up writing like small autofiction, which if you're a genius can be good, but I don't know. It just sort of feels like a small way of doing literature. Like we don't have like too many Prousts these days.
So you bring up briefly the figure of Delicious Tacos and these kind of, I suppose this realm of sort of, I don't know, dissident literature, which often is written by people of this demographic profile who, in many cases probably legitimately experience some sense of being squeezed out or not having opportunities within the literary world. And so I'm curious what you make of that, that sort of new realm of like indie publishing and the writers who have come out of it.
I mean, I think that like some of it, there are a few Delicious Tacos stories that I absolutely love, and some of it can be great, but it's just as small as it's like, not to keep harping on this, but like, the idea of literature is to like inhabit like a different world, and it just feels as solipsistic as the opposite for the most part. That and the other part of it is look, I think that if there was like some dissident writer was like a true genius and had written, like a David Foster Wallace level book, this would be a different discussion. But I think that they haven't yet. Maybe there's one coming. So it just feels like a sort of rebellion for its own sake, which like is respectable, but I don't. Again, what you want is some common literary culture, and I think that is not that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and as you sort of brought up before, it's also, it tends to have this kind of anti-institutional sensibility, and so it sort of deliberately, kind of self-marginalizing in that regard, perhaps.
No, and like, look, if people want to like write, want to write something that feels like incredibly true to them and is great, like all power to them. But I don't think like it's not, as a consumer, I'm not like a book critic, like a professional critic. I'm not like, my day job is scalping concert tickets on the internet. I'm just a suburban dad. But if they want to like write for a small audience like that is passionate about what they want to write about, that's great. But I think, again, like we live in a country of 330 million people, maybe 1 million of them reads books. Like it would be nice if there were books that people cared about. Like that are not completely siloed off from the rest of the culture.
All right. I think that's a good place to leave it. And, perhaps looking out for those forthcoming novels by white male millennials, perhaps there's something you could review for us down the line. So,
sure, that sounds great.
Would be interested to continue this theme in that area. So, thanks again.
Silo myself,
or not. Write about something else. It's all good. But thanks so much.
All right, thanks again.
That is it for this week's Compact Conversations. Thanks, Jacob. As always, remember, Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, so if you don't already subscribe, please do. CompactMag.com/subscribe. And please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels. Until next time.